Since Deltarune's plot has points that mirror Undertale in reverse, then are there direct parallels that can help us predict where the story is headed? Hi everyone, I'm Thax. As I just mentioned, while researching the inverse parallels between Deltarune and Undertale, I've been thinking, while there are many inversions, some things fundamentally remain the same. For instance, we still control a human soul, and monsters still turn to dust upon death. Most characters' personalities haven't really flipped. It's more like their preferences are reversed. Anyway, we can still spare enemies. These fundamental aspects, or what I would call mechanics, aren't inverted. Take the most obvious example, the tutorial. You can't just move the tutorial to the final chapter for the sake of inversion, right? And you can't just swap Asgore and Flowey's roles, having Asgore act as the guide in Deltarune. So, the tutorial must be in Chapter 1. Ralsei, who shares a connection with Azrael, much like Flowey did, is the perfect guide. So, if we find a direct parallel shared by both games and cross-reference them, could we use that to predict Deltarune's future? First, I want to bring up a theory that became much more credible after Chapters 3 and 4, the Gaster list theory. It originates from the naming sequence in Deltarune. While naming the vessel or yourself, a mystery man reacts to 18 known characters' names. The nature of these reactions isn't our focus today. If you're interested, you can see that gameplay clip on my channel. This mystery man communicates with us during vessel creation, asks if we want to try again after game over, and at the end of Chapter 4, says he's still waiting for Deltarune. In many ways, he seems like some kind of higher level observer. So for now, we'll just equate this figure with the legendary Dr. Gaster. Back to the topic, what exactly do these 18 characters have in common to trigger a reaction from him? Initially, in Chapter 1, we had Chris and Susie, but no pattern was clear. It wasn't until Noelle and Burley entered the Dark World in Chapter 2 that people began to speculate. Could this be a list of Lightners who will appear in the Dark World in the future? After all, that was the common link between Chris, Susie, Noelle, and Burley at the time. But this theory was debunked because Gerson's name was on that list. We knew from Chapter 1 that Gerson had passed away long ago, making a Dark World appearance unlikely. So, many people stopped taking this theory seriously. Until... I'm old! Gerson actually appeared in the Dark World in Chapter 4. And looking back, Toriel and Undyne also appeared in the Chapter 3 Dark World. So far, every character aligns with those mentioned on the Gaster list. Therefore, I now strongly believe the Gaster list predicts which Lightners will enter the Dark World. As I mentioned at the start, I'm looking for direct mechanisms shared by both Undertale and Deltarune. Hopefully, this mechanism can help us predict future events in Deltarune. If we assume the characters on the Gaster list are guaranteed to appear in the Dark World, could we consider this list itself as a Deltarune mechanism? But how do we link this mechanism back to Undertale? First, we must view these listed characters as key plot figures in Deltarune. Chris and Susie are obvious. Noelle and Burley play their major roles in Chapter 2. What about Toriel and Undyne? Even though Toriel slept through Chapter 3, Tenna hiding her was the catalyst for the party's conflict with Tenna. Toriel was also a target of the night, so even without much screen time, she remained a pivotal figure for that chapter. By that logic, the same applies to Undyne. She was taken by the night, which indirectly saved Toriel and made Susie realize the gravity of the situation. As for Gerson's significance in Chapter 4, that goes without saying. Alright, now that we have our list of key characters. Next, let's compare this with Undertale. Who are the key plot characters there? First, looking at Undertale's naming sequence, we find 7 names. Flowey, Toriel, Sans, Undyne, Alphys, Asgore, and Azrael. These can be entered, but they are forbidden and cannot be used. Papyrus and Metaton's full names are too long to type. However, they can be used in the Japanese version. But I argue this is because Undertale didn't have a Japanese version initially. So this was likely an oversight during the later translation. Otherwise, Following the English version's logic, all main character names should be restricted. Another reason I consider them main characters is that all 9 have unique dialogue portraits. This is a privilege that common NPCs don't have. Therefore, I categorize these 9 as the primary characters of Undertale. Next, let's define where these characters appear. Based on my inversion theory, chapters 1 to 7 correspond to New Home, Core, Heartland, Waterfall, Town, Snowdin, and the Ruins. Quick side note, I made a mistake previously. A wiki page for Snowdin Forest led me to believe that specific term existed, but the save points don't actually mention the word forest at all. But regarding my previous theory, you guys know what I meant, right? Great, let's move on. Anyway, since I'm looking for direct parallels, we should follow the order of Undertale's areas for chapters 1 to 7, like this. Let's look at the mapping. In the Ruins, there are Flowey and Toriel. Based on the list, chapter 1 has Chris and Susie. Some might ask, wait, why didn't you count the Undertale protagonist? If you counted Chris, why wouldn't you count the Undertale protagonist? First, and most importantly, this allows for a 2-character match with Deltarune. Secondly, in Undertale, we essentially have full control over the protagonist. At least during normal gameplay, we don't feel like the protagonist and the player are separate. But Chris is different. Throughout the story, it's clear that Chris and our human soul are 2 distinct entities. Therefore, I haven't included the Undertale protagonist as a major corresponding character. Moving on. In the Snowdin, there are Sans and Papyrus. Based on the list, chapter 2 has Noelle and Birdley. Though Chris and Susie appear in every chapter, Noelle and Birdley already create a 2-for-2 match with Sans and Papyrus. So, I propose another rule. This character correspondence only applies to their first appearance in the Dark World. It doesn't apply to recurring appearances. Thus, after chapter 1, Chris and Susie are no longer counted. The same applies to other characters on the list. However, since Undertale has significantly fewer major characters than Deltarune, they will be counted repeatedly. Okay, let's continue. In the town, there are Sans and Papyrus. Based on the list, chapter 3 has Toriel and Undyne. In the waterfall, there are Sans, Papyrus, and Undyne, while chapter 4 has Gerson. Wait, that's 3 to 1. Is something wrong? What's off? First, Undyne is undoubtedly the key character of Waterfall, no doubt about that. So the issue must be with Sans and Papyrus. This mapping is based on the fact that, right after the Papyrus fight, Sans takes over sentry duty, and Papyrus reports to Undyne. But what if we consider that entire report sequence as still being part of the town area? In that case, Sans and Papyrus will no longer be counted within Waterfall's scope. It might seem a bit odd, but it makes sense. This is the junction between Waterfall and town. The spatial boundaries here are blurred. However, with this setup, town now has Undyne, in addition to Sans and Papyrus. That makes 3. But didn't chapter 3 only have Toriel and Undyne? Wait, there's one more. The Roaring Night. Perhaps the night is also one of the lighteners mentioned on Gaster's list. That would perfectly match the 3 characters in town. That covers the mapping for chapters 1 through 4. There are still 10 characters on the list who have yet to appear in the Dark World. Now, let's continue counting the key characters in each area of Undertale. In the Heartland, there are Undyne, Sans, Alphys, and Metaton. Since Undyne chased us all the way there, she counts as an appearance. In the core, there are Metaton and Alphys. In the new home, there are Sans, Asgore, and Flowey. Oh, I forgot to mention, for this mapping, we're looking at it from a neutral route perspective. Otherwise, everyone appearing in the true pacifist ending would completely ruin the count. So, the neutral route is the only logical choice. But looking at it this way, 4 plus 2 plus 3 equals 9. We're missing a character. What happened? Then, I thought of something. Sans appears at the MTT resort, which is right between Heartland and the core. But would it be a stretch to categorize the MTT resort as part of the core? The resort entrance is still one room away from the core's lobby. Even I found it hard to justify counting suns in the course range at that distance. While pondering a better way to group them, I remembered a viewer's theory from my last video. That theory suggested Undertale weapons correspond to Deltarune's secret bosses. The empty gun corresponds to Spamton Neo, who definitely represents the core. But you obtain the empty gun at the MTT resort. Does this mean Undertale's plot regions are defined not just by geography, but by weapons? Since the shop with the empty gun is right by the MTT resort entrance, it makes sense to count sands in the core. That brings the core's count to 3. 4 plus 3 plus 3 equals 10. A perfect match. It actually makes sense. In my last video, I predicted the Chapter 5 secret boss corresponds to Undertale's town, but its weapon counterpart was the ballet shoes found early in Waterfall. This suggests the region town might extend all the way to the beginning of Waterfall. This also explains why the papyrus reports to Undyne fits within the town's plot range. As for the 10 remaining characters on Gaster's list, we can use their connections to predict their appearances in future chapters. The most obvious examples are Caddy and Jockington. This pair of best friends, they will almost certainly enter the Dark World together. Then there's Brady and Caddy, the best friends in Undertale. It's unlikely they'd have major roles apart from one another. Brady interacting with other characters just doesn't make sense. Similarly, we haven't seen Papyrus interact with anyone else yet. It's hard to imagine him pair with anyone but Sans. So, we have 3 pairs that simply cannot be split up. Next, based on my inversion theory, Chapter 5 takes place at Noelle's house. So, from the remaining 10 characters, we need to pick the 4 most likely candidates. Based on the prophecy's description of Chapter 5, Asgore is very likely to appear. As I've explained, Asgore currently works as a helper for the Holiday family, so his presence is logical. The next likely candidate is Catty, Noelle's childhood friend. They watch movies together and discuss the occult. I also have a key point. At the end of Chapter 1, you can talk to Noelle, and Susie is a dialogue option. This reminds me of talking to Catty after church in Chapter 4. He also has a Susie option. In Chapter 1, Noelle entered the Dark World in the very next chapter. By that same logic, I believe it's highly likely Catty will appear in the next chapter, Chapter 5. Add her best friend, Jockington, and that makes 3. I think the most logical 4th person is Rudy. After all, it's his own home. It wouldn't be unusual for him to stop by on the morning of the festival. There's more to explore here, but we'll get to that. Let's move on to the character combinations for Chapters 6 and 7. Chapters 6 and 7 both feature 3 characters appearing. As I mentioned earlier, there are certain inseparable combinations. First, the duo of Brady and Caddy. Who should they pair with to make their joint appearance work? My guess is Alphys. From our experience in Undertale, we know that before Alphys became the royal scientist, she was very close friends with Brady and Catty. She would take them to the dump to scavenge for interesting items. So, I believe that for Brady and Caddy to become best friends in Deltarune like they were in Undertale, it might be linked to Alphys. Next, Sans and Papyrus. I think this chapter might explore sibling dynamics. Therefore, Asriel might appear and share some brotherly moments with Chris, creating a parallel to the Sans and Papyrus duo. Alright, that's it. The numbers match perfectly. Wait, what? I missed one? Who? QC? Oh right, the bunny shopkeeper. Wait a second. Doesn't that make exactly 18? How could? Oh, hold on. There's one character I included, whose identity we don't know yet. The Roaring Knight. Exactly. QC is the Roaring Knight. Just kidding, obviously not. Based on what I said earlier, recurring Gaster list characters don't count. That means among the remaining 10 characters, one has already appeared in Chapter 3 as the Knight. This also implies that in Chapters 5, 6, or 7, if any chapter's count of first-time Dark World appearances breaks the 433 distribution, then one of those characters must be the Knight. My top suspect for the Knight's identity is currently Rudy, with Asriel as a second. But if my suspicion is correct, Chapter 5 would be missing one first-time Dark World appearance from Gaster's list. Does this mean QC is supposed to fill that vacancy in Chapter 5? But wouldn't it be strange for QC to show up at Noel's house? Exactly. That's not what I'm thinking. Based on my rule that recurring characters from the list don't count toward the tally, I suspect a different character from the list will enter Noel's house instead. Then, that future vacancy will be filled by QC in a later chapter. As for the remaining 6 characters on the list, I think 3 are particularly likely candidates. The first is Alphys. Since she's their teacher, it wouldn't be hard to come up with a reason for her to be at Noel's house. However, I think the probability is quite low. I suspect she's more likely to appear in the chapter where we actually have to rescue Undyne. Given her deep connection with Undyne in Undertale, appearing right when Undyne needs her would be the perfect way to establish their relationship in this world. So, while it's not impossible, I'm leaning towards her not being in Chapter 5. The second candidate is Cathy. As Cathy's older sister, it's certainly possible she could follow Cathy to Noel's house. Plus, there seems to be some distance between her and her younger sister. The Dark World could be the perfect way for them to finally understand each other. But, considering she needs to appear alongside Bratty later, I don't think her character is prominent enough to justify 2 major appearances. If she gets 2, then why didn't our favorite Birdly? In fact, it's more likely that Cathy will reappear later in the chapter featuring Cathy. So, based on character weight, I don't think Cathy will debut in Chapter 5. The final candidate is Asriel. From the beginning of Chapter 1, we've known that Asriel is returning next week. In Christian and biblical traditions, the week begins on Sunday. In the deeply religious world of Deltarune, it's highly likely this system is used. For a college student, whether by personal choice or school schedule, returning home for a special festival is perfectly reasonable. Given the close ties between the Dreamers and the holidays, it makes sense for Asriel to go to Noel's house with Chris, or even visit on his own. Therefore, Asriel is a strong candidate to appear in the Chapter 5 Dark World at Noel's house. And given his importance, it would be entirely appropriate for him to enter the Dark World again in future chapters, don't you think? One more thing regarding the official Chapter 5 teaser dialogue from earlier this year, specifically the part where Susie talks about horror movies. I'm curious, how could she guess Asriel's reaction to a horror movie? She barely knows him, yet she can predict his reaction. Could it be because she met him in person earlier that day? Because they spoke face to face, her impression of him became much clearer. That would explain how she could guess his reaction later on. Does that sound plausible? To sum up, the amount of content in Chapter 5 is going to be staggering. We'll likely see a massive lineup of major characters in the Dark World. The main trio, including Rousey, Noel, Asgore, Cathy, Jockington, 1 wildcard candidate, and potentially the Knight. That makes a total of 9 major characters. I can totally understand why the release of Chapter 5 was pushed back. With such a cast, the narrative depth will surely surpass anything we've seen before. It might even help us indirectly narrow down the Knight's identity. I'm getting more and more hyped for Chapter 5. Of course, that's assuming my theories so far aren't completely off the mark. I know that by mentioning the Knight, many of you might feel this theory overlooks other potential candidates. And that's true. I don't deny it. But no theory is ever perfect. Since the perspective of this video is built around Gaster's list and my previous logical framework, it naturally doesn't account for characters outside of that list. Think of this theory as an alternative supporting argument for the candidates who are on Gaster's list. And that's it for my predictions on future character appearances based on Gaster's list. If you have any thoughts, please feel free to leave a comment below. I'm Fax. I'll see you in the next theory. Actually, there probably won't be any more theories for a while. We just have to wait for Chapter 5 to see the results. Honestly, I'm a bit nervous. I've made quite a few non-mainstream guesses. It would be pretty embarrassing if I don't even get half of them right. Anyway, that's all for now. Wishing my theories smooth sailing. Bye bye everyone.